All right, now we're going to create a new route to register new users. So here in the routes folder, I'm going to add a new file, users.js. Now, once again, to save time, I'm going to go to genres.js and copy these require statements as well as the first route into our new module. So copy, paste it here. Now let's make changes. So on the top, we need to import the user model instead of genre. So from models/user, we import the user class as well as the validate function. We also need mongoose, express, and router. So here we add our new route, which is post for creating new users, for registering new users. And finally, we need to export this router. So module that exports, we set this to this router. Now we need to go back to our index.js and tell Express that for any routes that starts with /API/users, it should use this router that we're exporting here. So let's go to index.js. On the top, let's import this new module. So constant users, we set this to require from the routes folder /users. And then here we call app.use, give our path /API/users, and our router, that is users. Okay, so we have built the big picture. Now let's go back to our users module and implement this new route. So here we need to validate the request. If it's not valid, we're going to return a 400 error, which is bad request. Otherwise, we're going to create a new user object and save it to the database. Now, I'm going to borrow some more code from our genres module. So genres.js. Let's look at the post method right here. I'm going to get this code as a template. So copy this back to the users module, paste it here. And by the way, I'm only doing this because I don't want to waste your time watching me type all this by hand. In the real world, you should avoid copy-paste approach, unless you're very careful and you're going to read every single line of the copied code to make sure you didn't make a mistake. It's always better to type the code by hand. So back here, the first two lines, we're going to keep them exactly as they are. We want to validate the request. We're using our joy validate function. So if the name, email, or password properties are not valid, we're going to return a 400 error to the client. Now, next, we need to do another kind of validation. We want to make sure that this user is not already registered. So we call user.find1, pass a query object here. We're looking for a user with a given email, that is request.body.email. So note that here I didn't use find by ID because we're not looking up the user by their ID. We're looking them up by one of their properties. So find one. Now this returns a promise, so we await it and get a user object. Now in this case, I'm defining a variable instead of a constant because later we're going to reset this, as you will see in a second. So in this case, if we do have this user object in the database, we should return a bad request error to the client. So return response.status 400, which is bad request, .send. Here's the message. User already registered. I'm trying to type slowly so you can catch up with me if you're coding along. So at this point, we have a valid user object. This user is not registered in the database, so we need to save this user in the database. So here I'm going to reset this user object because at this point it should be null. We set this to a new user. Let me scroll up. And here we set the properties. So name, we set this to request.body.name. Email to request.body.email. And password to request.body.password. So this is our user object. Now we save it. So await user.save. And finally, return this to the client. So we don't need these two lines for working with the genre. Delete. And finally, return this new user to the client. Now let's test this. So back in Postman, I'm going to send a post request to localhost port 3000/API/users. And then in the body of the request, I'm going to set this to raw. Here we pass a JSON object with 3 properties. Name, Mosh. Actually, I forgot to set the type to JSON. That's why we don't have syntax highlighting. So let's change this to JSON application JSON. Okay, that's better. Then we set email. I'm going to set an invalid email. And I'm not going to set the password either. I want to make sure our validation function is working properly. So send. Okay, we got a bad request. That's good. Name length must be at least 5 characters long. So maybe that's a strict requirement. So I cannot register my own name. All right, now let's send another request. We got another bad request. Email length must be at least 5 characters long. So let's change this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But this is not a valid email. So now we should get a different error. Email must be a valid email. Beautiful. So let's change this to programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. Let's send another request. Okay, now we get password is required. Beautiful. Finally, let's add a password that is at least 5 characters long. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Send. This time we got a 200 response. Beautiful. And this is the user object that we stored in the database. So we have the ID property as well as name, email, and password. Now, when registering a new user, we don't want to return their password to the client. So that's something we're going to fix in the next lecture. But let's send another request with the exact same values. This time we should get a different error telling us that this user is already registered. So send. Okay, we got another bad request. And here's the message, user already registered. Beautiful. So in the next lecture, we're going to modify the response of this API endpoint.